In the heart of Chicago's Gilded Age, where progress roared louder than compassion, a single message was sent to the wrong man and changed 2 lives forever. She was a humble telegraph operator, unseen by the world she helped connect. He was a powerful tycoon, trapped in the silence of his own success. What began as a mistake soon became a secret exchange of souls, letters filled with truth, longing, and the kind of love neither dared to speak aloud. But what happens when ink and honesty collide with pride and power? Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe that one letter can change the course of a lifetime? Chicago, winter of 1887. Smoke from the rail yards curled through the frozen air, mixing with the sharp scent of iron and coal. The city pulsed with progress. Carriages rattling along Michigan Avenue, street lamps hissing to life as dusk painted the skyline with copper light. Yet within the narrow rooms of the Western Union office, time seemed to move slower, marked only by the rhythmic tapping of telegraph keys and the soft rustle of paper. Ellen Prescott sat at her desk near the frosted window, her gloved fingers trembling slightly from the cold that seeped through every crack of the walls. The faint glow of a gas lamp illuminated her face, pale, thoughtful, and lined with quiet exhaustion. Her hazel eyes followed the flow of coded messages that passed through her hands, words meant for others, fragments of lives she would never know. Each day began the same way, the hiss of steam from the rail lines, the clicking of machinery, and the ache of her heart pressing against a silence she no longer dared to break. But on that particular evening, when the streets outside glistened with a thin layer of ice, Ellen's thoughts drifted toward her sister Clara, whom she had not seen in years. A letter half-written lay beside her telegram pad, a confession of longing, of regret, of the weight of solitude. She hesitated, reading it again under the lamplight. It was not a message for sending, merely one of those letters she wrote to herself when words became her only companions. Still, as the office grew emptier and the shadows lengthened across the walls, she copied a few lines onto a telegraph form, thinking to finish it later. Her heart, heavy with weariness, sought relief in the familiar rhythm of the keys. But a small error, one misplaced symbol, would change everything. Unaware that her personal message had been transmitted with the evening dispatches, Ellen tidied her station, placed her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the bitter cold. Snow fell softly over the rail lines, each flake glowing briefly beneath the gas lamps before vanishing into the dark. She pulled her cloak tighter, never imagining that her quiet words were already on their way to a man who had long forgotten what tenderness felt like. In a grand office overlooking the same city, Henry Caldwell sat alone behind a mahogany desk. The fire burned low, casting shifting shadows across portraits of locomotives and steel bridges, symbols of an empire built through precision and will. His expression was calm, almost cold, the face of a man who had learned to silence the noise of grief by surrounding himself with work, yet beneath that discipline there lingered a sorrow he refused to name. When the telegram arrived, Henry reached for it without interest. He received dozens each day, figures, reports, endless negotiations. But this one was different. The message bore no company seal, no formality, no address of trade, only a simple line of words that trembled with emotion. I sometimes wonder if there is still kindness left in a world built on ambition. Henry read it once, then again. The words struck him like an unexpected note in a symphony long forgotten. They were neither pleading nor naive, only honest. He leaned back in his chair, frowning slightly as the firelight flickered across his eyes. Somewhere behind those words he sensed a woman's voice, quiet but strong, shaped by hardship and dignity. For the first time in years, he did not dismiss the paper. Instead, he placed it on his desk, beside a letter he had never opened, one written by his late wife before she died. He stared at both messages, the past and the present bound by ink and silence. Then, with deliberate care, He reached for a pen. The snow fell heavier outside as he began to write. His reply was short, cautious, almost formal at first, but as the ink flowed, a strange warmth stirred in his chest, softening the rigid lines of his words. When he signed it, he paused for a moment before adding only his initials, H.C. In the telegraph office, Ellen returned the next morning to find a folded note upon her desk. She frowned, recognizing her own handwriting on the transmitted form. The clerk told her it had gone through the night shift by mistake, and that a reply had already come. Her heart skipped. A reply. She unfolded the telegram slowly, the paper crackling in her hands. The words were simple, yet they carried an unexpected gentleness. "There is still kindness, miss. You proved it by wondering." Ellen's breath caught. She reread the sentence, her cheeks warming beneath the pale light of morning. The letter she had never meant to send had found an answer, from a stranger who wrote as if he had known her heart. Outside, the whistles of departing trains echoed across the city, fading into the distance like promises yet unspoken. Ellen folded the telegram carefully, pressing it close to her chest. She did not know who had written it, nor what destiny awaited her now, but something within her stirred, fragile, yet alive. And in another part of Chicago, Henry Caldwell watched the snow through his tall windows, unaware that his first letter to a stranger would soon awaken a part of himself he thought had been buried beneath iron and time. The days that followed were draped in a pale grey sky, the kind that seemed to hang low over Chicago like a woolen blanket soaked in soot. The sharp clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the hiss of steam escaping iron lungs, and the perpetual tremor of the city's breath gave rhythm to Ellen Prescott's every step. Yet beneath that mechanical hum, something quieter stirred, an unspoken pulse, hidden deep within the folds of her everyday life. Ellen had always believed herself to be a woman of reason, of steady hands and modest dreams. Her world was built on schedules and silence, the precise language of dots and dashes, the creak of the wooden telegraph bench, and the warm tea her mother sipped each night from the same chipped porcelain cup. But ever since that first unexpected telegram had arrived, her thoughts wandered more freely. She had not expected another reply. One message might have been a courtesy, a stranger's polite answer to an accidental note. But when she returned to the office on the third morning and found a second folded form addressed to her initials, her heart trembled in a way she had never known. This second message, like the first, was brief, only a few lines. But within those lines, she sensed something more than politeness. There was attentiveness, curiosity, even a shadow of something wounded. "I have long forgotten what kindness feels like. Yet your words returned it to me, quietly. May I ask, what keeps you awake at night?" Ellen did not answer immediately. That night, she sat by the window of the boarding house where she lived, her knees wrapped in a woolen blanket, her fingers trembling over a half-finished letter. Snowflakes clung to the sill. Her mother slept in the adjoining room, her breath faint but steady. The gaslight flickered with each gust of wind that slipped under the door. At last, with measured hand, Ellen wrote, "Sometimes I fear I will spend my life unheard, not unloved exactly, but unseen. My days pass in quiet service, to machines, to duty, to others. I wonder if that will be all I ever am. But I have found some comfort in writing to you, whoever you are." She signed only her initials, E.P. Across the city, in an office far above the icy streets, Henry Caldwell read those words beneath the glow of a desk lamp carved from black onyx. The Tycoon, whose name commanded respect in every railway corridor from New York to Denver, held the thin sheet of paper as if it were made of silk. The formality in her tone, her careful restraint, only deepened the impact of her truth. Her voice, though unknown, was unmistakably real. It pierced the polished walls of his solitude in a way that no business transaction, no dinner party or boardroom victory ever had. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, he was not thinking of markets or expansion routes. He was thinking of a woman who called herself EP, a woman who understood loneliness without bitterness. In his next reply, he chose his words with great care. I, too, have spent many years unseen. Or perhaps I have simply chosen to hide behind smoke and steel. Sometimes I wonder what might have become of me if I had taken a different road. You ask what keeps me awake at night. Regret, mostly. And lately, you. He paused before signing it. Then, once again, HC at Western Union, Ellen read his letter in secret, tucked between shift changes and moments when no one was watching. The lines were elegant but unadorned, the thoughts restrained yet piercing. She never imagined a stranger might carry such sorrow, and that her simple confession might matter to him. Over the following weeks, their correspondence became a lifeline, one wrapped in silence and paper. The letters arrived irregularly, as if dictated not by time, but by courage. Neither dared to ask for more than words. Neither broke the fragile illusion of distance. But each note became a thread in an invisible tapestry, weaving two distant lives into something shared, if not yet spoken aloud. Ellen spoke of her mother's illness in her letters, not as a complaint, but as a truth. Of the small joys she found in books left behind by tenants long gone, of the scent of coal mixed with lilacs from the garden no one tended anymore. She described the warmth of her friend Mary Lou's laughter, the ache in her back after hours hunched over the transmitter, and her quiet longing to matter to someone once, even if only briefly. Henry listened through the ink. His own words were more guarded. He never spoke of his position, never mentioned railroads or boardrooms. Instead, he told her of his boyhood in Ohio, of his love for rivers and the way the wind moved through tall grass. He described the echo of an empty house, the way a fireplace could burn without ever warming the air, and how sometimes a man could be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone. In Ellen's imagination, HC became many things. Perhaps he was a teacher, retired, perhaps a widower, or a clerk with too many books and too few friends. He seemed older than her, but not by much. His language was precise, but never cold. She could almost hear his voice in her mind, low, steady, and kind. She never imagined he sat each night in a tower of steel and glass, his name whispered with either awe or dread in every corridor of the industry. But others did begin to notice. Samuel Worthington, Henry's secretary and most trusted aide, had spent 15 years observing his employer with the discretion of a man who understood power. When Henry began dismissing reports unread and requesting privacy in the late afternoons, Samuel grew curious. One evening, after Henry left the office earlier than usual, Samuel noticed a telegram slip left on the corner of his desk, folded neatly but unfiled. It bore the initials EP. Samuel read it with hesitant eyes. He did not recognize the name, nor the handwriting. But what he did recognize, immediately, was that the words had changed something in Henry. In the following days, Samuel quietly investigated the transmission records. He found a pattern in the origin station and narrowed down the location to a small, struggling Western Union branch near the rail yards. It was a curious place for someone to hold such power over a man like Henry Caldwell. He said nothing, not yet. Instead, he watched. He watched as the Tycoon declined an invitation to the Vanderbilt estate. He watched him stand in front of the fireplace for hours, unread letters resting in his lap, lost in thoughts that no longer belonged to profit margins. And though Samuel did not yet know the full truth, he sensed it was delicate, perhaps even dangerous. For when a man like Henry began to feel again, the entire city might tremble beneath the weight of his transformation. But for Ellen, none of that existed. Her world remained tucked within the lines of each telegram, each careful word exchanged between two initials. She did not know that her letters now sat in the inner pocket of Henry Caldwell's coat, pressed over his heart like sacred scripture. Nor did she know that somewhere beyond the haze of factory smoke, a man was beginning to hope again, not for power, not for victory, but for the sound of a voice he had never heard, and the hand he had never held. Winter pressed deeper into Chicago's bones. The city stood beneath a leaden sky, the lake wind biting at the seams of every coat and creeping through the cracks of tenement windows. Ice formed delicate webs on the corners of horse troughs and along the edges of brick buildings, as if time itself had slowed, suspended in frost. In the Western Union office near the rail yards, Ellen Prescott stood by the tall window with a pot of warm tea cupped in her hands. Her breath clouded the glass, and she rubbed the pane with the edge of her sleeve, revealing a street that seemed caught between motion and stillness. Men in heavy coats rushed past, hats pulled low, boots splashing through slush. A flower girl tucked her freezing fingers beneath her shawl. Smoke rose in narrow ribbons from the foundries in the distance, and across the street, without warning, her gaze landed on a man watching her. He stood beside a black carriage trimmed in silver, the kind that belonged to someone of influence. His coat was made of fine wool, and his top hat cast a shadow across his eyes. But even through the fogged glass, she could feel the weight of his stare. Calm, deliberate, strangely solemn. Something in her chest fluttered. Not fear, not recognition, just a quiet pull, like the whisper of an old melody whose lyrics she had long forgotten. She turned away quickly, her cheeks flushed. She chided herself for imagining things. Important men didn't stand in the snow, gazing at telegraph windows. And yet, she lingered near the sill a moment longer. The man did not move. He merely observed. Then, as the streetcar bell rang in the distance, he tipped his hat, an almost imperceptible gesture, and stepped back into the waiting carriage. The horses clattered away, leaving only steam in their wake. Ellen returned to her desk, her heart drumming softly beneath the lace collar of her blouse. She would not mention it to anyone, not even Mary Lou, whose playful suspicions would surely turn the incident into a romance of its own. But that night, when the last transmission had been sent and the city quieted beneath a blanket of snow, Ellen sat in the corner of the small boarding-house parlor with a fountain pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper resting on her knees. She began her letter without salutation. Their names, if they were even true, remained absent from the page. But what unfolded in her writing was more intimate than any title could contain. When I was a girl, I believed the world to be made of stories. I thought everyone carried a secret tale waiting to be heard. My father used to tell me the wind over the lake was a song from the past, and if I stood very still, I could hear what had been lost. But somewhere along the way, I stopped listening. I don't know why. Perhaps grief dulls the ear, or perhaps the city is too loud to remember quiet things. She paused, her pen trembling. Then she continued, I do not know your name, but your words have made me remember the girl who once believed in stories, and in believing, I find that the cold does not feel quite so bitter. She sealed the letter with steady hands, unaware that across the city her words would land not in a stranger's desk, but in the private study of Henry Caldwell, the very man she had seen from behind the glass. Henry read her letter in the silence of his office, the gaslight casting a golden halo over the lines. His fingers brushed the edges of the page as if it was something fragile. A part of him feared these letters, for they awakened emotions long buried beneath iron schedules and boardroom walls. In her words, he saw a life unpolished but real, a life shaped not by wealth, but by tenderness and quiet courage. And more than once, he caught himself rereading her letters, late into the night, long after the final ink had dried on contracts that no longer thrilled him. His replies became less guarded. He still offered no names, no clues of his position, but his emotions, once wrapped in steel, now seeped through his sentences like sunlight through drapes. I have built many things in my life, but nothing that ever felt as alive as these letters. You speak of remembering stories. I had forgotten mine entirely, and somehow you've begun to return it to me. The words were not poetry, but they were sincere. Meanwhile, within the ornate halls of Caldwell Enterprises, Samuel Worthington continued his quiet inquiries. He was no longer merely suspicious. He was certain. The initials matched. The originating telegraph office was consistent, and one glance through the employee records confirmed what he had suspected. Miss Ellen Prescott, age 32, telegraph operator, boarding at a modest address on South Clark Street. Samuel did not report this discovery. He kept it locked within the corners of his mind, watching Henry closely. He saw how the Tycoon now walked with a different gait, less rigid, less burdened. He noticed how his employer paused by the window more often, gazing not at ledgers, but at the snow, as if searching for a memory he had yet to place. One evening, as they reviewed the week's financial reports, Samuel ventured a remark. "Forgive me, sir, but it occurs to me that not all connections are made with wire and steel." Henry glanced up, a flicker of something crossing his features. "Is that so?" he asked, voice measured. Samuel nodded. "Sometimes the most powerful ones are made of paper and silence." Henry did not respond, but he closed the report and rose from his chair, his fingers resting briefly over the inside pocket of his coat, where Ellen's latest letter now resided. Back in her room, Ellen pressed her reply against her chest before tucking it into the envelope. She would never know what compelled her to write so freely, so openly to a man she had never seen. All she knew was that the act of writing made her feel visible, as if someone somewhere saw her not as a function, but as a soul. And still, she could not forget the man in the carriage. Each morning she scanned the street before entering the office. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence, a passing stranger with cold hands and a warm coat. Yet her eyes lingered longer than she cared to admit. She never imagined the man she searched for was the very one who waited, with bated breath, for her next letter. The man who, despite all his power, had never been more powerless than when reading the words of a woman whose name he dared not yet speak aloud. And neither of them knew that, behind closed doors, a secret had already been uncovered, one that could change everything. But for now, it remained silent, resting like a snowflake on the edge of glass, waiting to fall. By the early days of February, the city of Chicago seemed made of smoke and snow. Grey clouds hung over the rooftops like damp wool, and the rails that crossed the industrial quarter gleamed faintly under the thin winter sun. The air tasted of iron and progress. Telegraph lines stretched like black veins above the streets, humming softly, carrying voices of strangers across miles of distance. Inside the Western Union office, the air was thick with tension. The tapping of the telegraph keys, once a steady rhythm that soothed Ellen Prescott's thoughts, had become sharp and erratic, like the sound of distant thunder. Workers spoke in hushed tones between transmissions. A rumor had begun to coil its way through the staff that the company was preparing to replace human operators with new machines, faster and cheaper, driven by electric automation. Ellen tried to ignore the whispers at first. Rumors were common in winter, when worry clung to the soul as persistently as cold to bone. Yet as the week went on, she noticed her supervisor's nervous pacing, the quiet arrival of new engineers taking notes at each desk, and the sudden disappearance of 2 operators from the evening shift. One morning, she found Mary Lou Rourke standing beside the notice board, her normally bright eyes clouded with worry. "They're cutting positions," Mary Lou whispered, her voice trembling. 2 offices in Springfield closed yesterday. Chicago could be next. Ellen's heart sank. "It cannot be so. We have families depending on these wages." Mary Lou sighed, clutching the edge of her shawl. "The Tycoons see numbers, not faces. To them, we're just part of the machinery." Ellen fell silent, her gaze resting on the telegraph instruments lined neatly across the tables. She thought of the hundreds of messages that passed through her hands each week. News of births, deaths, fortunes gained and lost. To think that one day those human hands could be replaced by cold mechanisms filled her with quiet dread. That afternoon, unable to bear the growing uncertainty, Ellen gathered the courage to speak to her supervisor, Mr. Klein, a thin man with restless fingers and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when nervous. "Sir," she began softly, "the workers are troubled. The rumors of closures. Might the company provide reassurance? We wish only to understand our future." Mr. Klein hesitated, avoiding her eyes. "Miss Prescott, this is no concern of yours. Decisions come from above. Best keep your attention on your keys." "But, sir," he raised a hand sharply. "Enough. It is not your place to question the board's policies. You are an operator, not a representative." The words struck her harder than she expected. She bowed her head, murmured an apology, and returned to her desk. Yet as she resumed her work, a quiet defiance stirred inside her chest. That night, after the office closed, Ellen lingered by her station long after the others had gone. The lamplight flickered over her face, reflecting in her eyes as she wrote another letter, not to her supervisor but to HC, the one person whose words still brought her comfort. "The world around me is changing faster than I can breathe," she wrote. "Men in coats and spectacles come to measure our worth in speed and numbers. They say machines will do what we do, only better. Yet no machine can hear a tremor in a voice or recognize sorrow between words. I fear what progress may cost us." When she sent the letter through the telegraph lines, she felt as though she had whispered into the wind, but she knew he would read it, and perhaps, in his quiet understanding, she might find peace. Far from the noise of the telegraph office, in a mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, Henry Caldwell sat in his study as snow fell against the tall windows. The fire burned low, casting copper light across the room's leather-bound books and polished brass instruments. Around him, the atmosphere of comfort and privilege offered no solace. On his desk lay a report from his board of directors. The lines were precise, written in the cool language of commerce. Reduce expenditures by 20%. Close underperforming branches. Automate where possible. Among the list of suggested closures, one name stood out to him like a wound: Clark Street Telegraph Station, the very office where Ellen worked. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. His heart, once hardened by years of business, now rebelled against the logic that had built his fortune. Ellen's words echoed in his mind. No machine can hear a tremor in a voice. For the first time, he questioned whether progress was worth its price. When Samuel Worthington, his loyal assistant, entered the room, he found Henry staring at the document in silence. "You have not signed the directive, sir," Samuel noted quietly. Henry's gaze remained fixed on the paper. "I will not sign it. Not yet. May I ask why?" Henry hesitated. "Because sometimes the numbers lie. They speak of profit, but never of consequence." Samuel studied him for a moment, the faintest trace of sympathy in his eyes. "You have changed, sir. A few months ago, you would have signed it without hesitation." Henry's lips curved in a faint, almost bitter smile. "Perhaps a few months ago I had nothing left to lose. Now—" He paused, the firelight catching the edge of his expression. "Now there is something, someone, I cannot harm, not even unknowingly." Samuel's brow furrowed. "The woman you write to." Henry turned sharply. "You know?" "I know enough," Samuel replied gently. "I have read her name on the dispatch records. Miss Ellen Prescott, a telegraph operator of modest means." The air between them thickened. Henry rose, his posture tense but not angry, merely weary. "She does not know who I am, and she must never find out." "Then you are building a tower upon sand," Samuel said, his voice low. "Secrets, even noble ones, do not last. You cannot keep her in the dark forever." Henry's eyes softened with a mixture of pride and despair. "You think I do not know that? Every time I sign my name as HC, I feel the weight of the lie. But if she knew, if she saw the name Caldwell on the letterhead, she would stop writing. She would see only the title, the fortune, the man she is taught to mistrust." Samuel lowered his gaze. "Then perhaps she deserves the truth, before the truth finds her first." Henry said nothing. He turned back toward the window, watching as snowflakes melted against the glass and slid down in pale rivulets. Each flake dissolved upon contact, as fragile and temporary as the comfort he found in Ellen's letters. Later that evening, he unfolded her most recent message again. Her words were simple, but each line trembled with quiet dignity. As he read, he imagined her face. He had seen it only once, through the frosted window of her telegraph office, yet it haunted him. The way she had stood, shoulders squared against the cold, light tracing the curve of her cheek, it had burned itself into his memory. He wrote a reply, slower than usual. "You speak of change, of fear for what may come. Yet it is you who remind me that what cannot be replaced still matters. Machines may quicken our world, but they cannot feel its pulse. Perhaps what frightens me most is that I am part of the same machine." He paused, his hand trembling slightly. Then with a sigh he signed it once more, H.C. At dawn the letter reached Ellen. She read it before the others arrived, standing by the window where frost had gathered overnight. The words carried warmth even in their restraint. For a long moment she simply held the telegram to her chest, her eyes glistening. She did not know that the man who had written those lines sat in boardrooms that decided her future. Nor did she know that far beyond her understanding, her quiet courage had already begun to alter the rhythm of his heart. But as the morning sun broke through the smoke and glimmered faintly on the telegraph wires outside, Ellen felt a strange certainty rise within her. Even if the world was made of iron and progress, somewhere between those cold threads, humanity still lived, and for the first time in years, she no longer felt alone. The morning arrived beneath a sky of pale copper, its hue tinged by the soot that lingered over Chicago's industrial quarter like a warning. Along the railways, men stood in silence, caps pulled low, faces drawn with a fury too long restrained. The city, always loud and impatient, now moved with a strange, charged stillness, as if waiting for a match to be struck. Within the Western Union office, Ellen Prescott arrived early, her fingers still red from the cold. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and lit the lamp at her desk. The office had grown quieter in recent days, not for lack of messages, but because even the urgency of telegrams could not drown the rising tension outside. Rumors of unrest had escalated to warnings, and warnings into threats. A strike was no longer whispered. It was imminent, but she had work to do. She always did. As she prepared her station, Mary Lou rushed through the door, cheeks flushed from the cold and voice breathless. "They're saying it starts today," she whispered. "The rail yard men, the unions. It's going to spread." Ellen turned toward her, steady despite the tremor that passed through the room. "And our office?" Mary Lou shook her head. "They say we're not the target. But if the rail lines stop, so do we. No messages. No movement." Ellen returned to her chair, her hands stilling over the metal keys. Outside, the streets were too quiet. Even the usual whistle of the morning train was absent, as if the city's pulse had missed a beat. Just before noon, the door opened again. This time, it was not a messenger or clerk. It was a man in a long black coat, the lapels trimmed in fine velvet, his presence commanding without uttering a word. His boots were polished, untouched by the mud of the streets, and his dark gloves held a folder of papers bound in leather. His hat remained in his hand as he stepped further inside. Ellen turned, and her breath caught mid-motion. It was him, the man from the street, the stranger she had seen through the glass weeks ago, the one whose gaze had lingered upon the building as if he carried questions too heavy for words. He did not speak at first. His eyes, grey like stone yet shadowed with thought, swept over the room, resting briefly on the frayed edges of the carpet, the aging telegraph machines, and finally, unmistakably, on Ellen. Their eyes met. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but something passed between them, a tension wrapped in recognition, though neither dared acknowledge it aloud. Ellen's heart thudded in her chest, as she lowered her gaze, confused by the heat that flushed her skin. She had never seen this man before, not truly, and yet it felt as if she had been waiting for him. Henry Caldwell remained composed, though the sight of her, no longer imagined but real, struck him harder than he had anticipated. She was more than the sum of her letters. She was the quiet dignity of hands worn from use, the grace of a woman who had learned to listen before speaking, the strength of someone who had remained gentle despite the weight of the world. "Good day," he said, his voice smooth but restrained. "I'm Henry Caldwell. I represent interests in the transportation sector. I'm here on behalf of the board to assess the status of communications in this district." Mr. Klein, the supervisor, emerged from the back room, suddenly deferential. "Of course, sir. We weren't expecting you personally." "I prefer to see things with my own eyes," Henry replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. Ellen listened in silence, her fingers resting on the edge of her desk. She dared not speak, but her mind raced. A tycoon, a man from the highest towers of commerce, stepping into her modest world. Why now? Henry allowed his gaze to sweep the room again. "I'd like a brief tour, and I'd like to speak to one of the operators." Mr. Klein gestured toward Ellen. "Miss Prescott is our most experienced." Henry nodded once. "Then Miss Prescott, if you please." Ellen rose, smoothing her skirts, and tried to ignore the sudden dryness in her throat. She felt exposed, as though the floor beneath her had thinned to glass. He followed her without comment as she walked him through the equipment, the transmission process, the careful documentation. Her voice was clear, steady, even as she refused to look at him too long. She did not know why she was so aware of his presence, of the quiet power in his movements, or the way he studied her, not with arrogance, but with something far more dangerous: curiosity. When the tour ended, he paused beside her desk. "You seem to care deeply for your work," he said softly. "I do, sir," she answered. "Because these machines may be steel and wire, but the messages they carry are made of hope and fear. Sometimes that's all people have." Henry swallowed hard. He could say nothing in that moment that wouldn't betray himself, so he simply nodded and took his leave. Hours later, as the lamps flickered with evening light, Ellen could still feel the shadow of his gaze on her skin. That night, Henry sat in his study, pen in hand, the words refusing to come. He had seen her, heard her voice, felt the tremor in his chest when her fingers brushed the brass telegraph key. He no longer wrote to an idea, he wrote to a woman. And now, the lie between them loomed like a wall he could no longer climb. He began the letter slowly, each word written with care. "Today, I saw someone who reminded me that dignity is not measured in titles or coins. It is found in how we carry ourselves when no one is watching. I have long wanted to tell you something that may change the way you see me." But he never finished the letter, because outside, in the night, the storm had begun. By morning, the city was no longer quiet. The strike erupted with fury. Railway lines were blocked by men holding torches and shouting slogans for justice. Smoke rose from distant depots, and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the alleys like the opening notes of a battle. The Western Union office was not spared. Ellen arrived early, only to find a crowd already forming outside. Angry workers, protesters, and in the midst of them, stones flying, signs raised, and fire beginning to consume a wooden storage crate at the rear of the building. She rushed inside with Mary Lou, only to be met by chaos. Machines overturned, papers scattered, ink bottles shattered on the floor like blood. "Out! Everyone out!" Mr. Klein shouted. "It's not safe!" But Ellen did not leave, not until she had gathered what she could: records, letters, transmissions still awaiting dispatch. As the windows cracked and smoke filled the room, she carried them out, clutching the messages to her chest like fragile children. Outside, a man grabbed her arm roughly. "Why defend the Tycoons?" he shouted. "They wouldn't do the same for you." Ellen looked him in the eyes. "I'm not defending them. I'm defending dignity." And then she let go of his hand and disappeared into the morning smoke. That night, in the silence of his study, Henry heard the news. Railway strike. Citywide paralysis. Western Union vandalized. He closed his eyes and saw her face, not broken, but burning with resolve. He reached for the letter he had started, but the words, once so close, were now lost in the fire. The days that followed the strike fell heavy over the city like smoke that refused to lift. Chicago, bruised and simmering, carried the scent of burnt paper, oil, and ash. In the streets, charred wood still lay scattered before the shuttered doors of factories and telegraph stations. The air was thick with the memory of shouting voices, shattered glass, and footsteps that had trampled the pavement in the name of justice or desperation, or both. Ellen Prescott had not returned to work since that morning. The Western Union office had been boarded up, the machines silenced, the walls blackened by smoke. But Ellen, who had emerged from the chaos not just unbroken but somehow stronger, found herself unable to simply wait for life to resume its course. Something inside her had shifted, something irrevocable. She had not written to HC since the night before the uprising. Her last message still echoed in her thoughts, a quiet admission of uncertainty, of hope clouded by fear. She had expected a reply, longed for it, but as the days passed and no answer came, she told herself it was understandable. Who could think of words when the city itself had caught fire? Instead, she walked. Each day, wrapped in her faded wool cloak and with a notebook hidden beneath her arm, Ellen moved through the neighborhoods most scarred by the strike. She listened to workers, noted names, recorded stories. A boy who had lost his father in a stampede at the stockyards. A mother turned away from the infirmary because she could not pay. A man with ink-stained hands who spoke of machines replacing men as if it were already decided by gods no one had ever seen. Mary Lou warned her more than once. "Ellen, you're risking everything. You've no employment contract anymore, no protection." But Ellen simply smiled and replied, "Then perhaps I am finally free to be useful." The local paper, the Evening Tribune, published an anonymous account of the riots a few days later. The article, written with unflinching honesty and a rare tenderness, spoke of courage, loss, and quiet defiance. Though unsigned, its style carried Ellen's fingerprints. Henry recognized them the moment his eyes fell upon the headline, "A woman in the crowd." He sat alone in his study, the fire behind him flickering low. The letter he had once begun, his confession, his unveiling, remained folded in a drawer, unfinished. Each day since the strike, he had replayed the moment he had seen her standing amid smoke and danger, cradling the letters she had saved from the wreckage. And each day he had hesitated, but no longer. That evening, after the lamps had been lit and the streets began to empty, Henry stepped out of his carriage in front of a modest boarding house on South Clark Street. He wore no overcoat despite the chill, only his dark wool suit and gloves. In his hand, he carried the letter he had rewritten a dozen times. The housekeeper greeted him with confusion, uncertain whether to summon the tenant in question. Henry declined gently. "I'll wait," he said, his voice low. Outside, Adul, the parlour's windows were fogged with the heat of the fireplace inside. Through them, he could see shadows moving, soft outlines cast by candlelight and conversation. He stood beneath the stoop's gas lamp, the flame flickering just above his shoulder, illuminating the snow that had begun to fall again in slow, deliberate flakes. Then he heard her voice. Ellen's voice was unmistakable. She was speaking to another tenant, her tone composed, but firm. He could not see her face clearly from where he stood, but her words, carried through the open transom window, cut deeper than anything he had prepared for. "I once believed that powerful men could choose to be different," she said, "that even those born to wealth might look beyond the ledgers and see the people who kept the world running. But I was mistaken. To them, we are the rust on the gears, replaceable, disposable." The listener, a young man with workman's hands and a bandage at his temple, nodded solemnly. "But there's talk," he said. "Some say one of them refused the closures, that he's protecting the district." Ellen's answer came without hesitation. If he truly cared, he'd stand among us. He'd speak to us, not for us. Until then, it's just another story told to keep us quiet. Henry's hand, still clutching the letter, lowered to his side. The words struck him like wind against a frozen lake, shocking, honest, impossible to ignore. He did not wait for her to come out. He walked away. Each step back toward the carriage felt heavier than the last, as if the snow beneath his boots turned to stone. When the coachman turned to ask if they should return home, Henry simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the city lights vanishing behind a veil of snow. He did not send the letter, not right away. But 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Ellen's door with a sealed envelope. No return address, no name, only the initials she knew by heart. Her hands trembled as she opened it. I came to you with the truth in my hands, but the truth is only valuable when given freely. I heard your words, and I do not fault you for them. You spoke with the voice of every soul who has ever been cast into the shadows of someone else's success. I've lived among titles and silence for so long that I forgot what it meant to be seen without them. But I have seen you, not just with my eyes, but with something deeper. You are not a story, Miss Prescott. You are the reason I write, the reason I breathe. Forgive me if you can, or do not, but I could not leave without giving you this. The name you have unknowingly addressed in each letter. Henry Caldwell. Ellen read the name again and again. The candle beside her flickered violently, as if caught in the wind, though the room was still. Her mind could not grasp what her heart already knew. She stood motionless, the letter crushed softly against her chest. He had been with her all along, not just in ink and paper, but in the very silence she had filled with hope. February drew to a close beneath skies the color of steel. Chicago, still bruised by the strike and its aftermath, wore its wounds in silence. The snow no longer fell as gently. It drifted in heavy sheets, staining the corners of rooftops and burying the debris that had not yet been cleared. And though the city's carriages rolled forward and telegrams once again passed through copper wires, something had shifted beneath the surface. At the modest boarding house on South Clark Street, Ellen Prescott lived in a quiet she no longer welcomed. The letter bearing Henry Caldwell's name rested at the bottom of her writing desk, folded and unread since that first night. She could not bring herself to destroy it, yet neither could she open it again. The man she had imagined, the one whose words had once lit the dim corners of her heart, had turned out to be real, and that reality had shaken her more than any lie. She had stopped writing, to him, to anyone. The words, once her refuge, had dried up like ink left too long in winter air. Her evenings were now spent by the hearth, sewing seams she had already mended twice, listening to the soft wheezing of her mother asleep in the adjoining room. Mary Lou visited often, urging her gently to return to her writing, to the Tribune, to the Western Union Post soon to be repaired, but Ellen offered only vague smiles and the occasional, perhaps tomorrow. The truth, unspoken, hung between them like smoke, persistent, bitter, impossible to clear. Across the city, in the shadows of a marble estate overlooking the lake, Henry Caldwell wandered the cold halls of his home like a ghost in mourning. He no longer dined with guests, no longer attended meetings in person. The servants moved about with caution, whispering of a man who once governed with precision, now haunted by silence. In his study, the fire often burned out without him noticing. Letters from the board remained unopened. His correspondence lay scattered across his desk, a monument to abandonment. And still, on the edge of that same desk, remained a single box, filled with the letters she had written to him, each one unfolded, smoothed, and reread until the ink had begun to fade. He had been wrong to believe that the truth, when revealed, would set them free. It had only deepened the distance. It was Samuel Worthington, loyal and perceptive as always, who finally broke the silence. Late one evening he entered Henry's study uninvited, his wool coat dusted with snow, his eyes steady beneath his spectacles. "I've just come from the Clark Street district," he said quietly. Henry looked up from the fireplace where no flame burned. And? Samuel paused, then stepped forward. The telegraph station is being rebuilt, slowly. Repairs are underfunded, workers are returning, but morale is low. Supplies are scarce. Henry said nothing. Samuel took another step. She's still there. Miss Prescott, visiting the sick, helping organize relief. She refuses recognition even when the paper mentions her. Henry's gaze dropped to the floor. Samuel set a small envelope on the desk. The foreman gave me this. Donations began arriving 2 weeks ago. Cash, tools, lantern oil, unsigned. But they trace back here, quietly, through third parties. The men know. They won't say it aloud, but they know someone is watching. Henry did not reach for the envelope. Samuel's voice lowered, gentler. If you mean to do good, sir, do it openly. If you mean to mend something broken, it must be with both hands, not from behind closed doors. Henry raised his eyes, the weariness in them unmistakable. You think I've done this for her? I know you have, Samuel said, not unkindly, but that does not make it wrong, only unfinished. That night, after Samuel left, Henry returned to the study and began writing, not a letter but a list, a quiet plan, no headlines, no signatures, only small actions, the kind that spoke without asking to be heard. Within days, donations flowed again, now larger. New wooden desks arrived at the Western Union station, still smelling of sawdust and varnish. Fresh uniforms were distributed to operators. Broken glass panes were replaced with thick, clear glass that held warmth better than before. No name accompanied the gifts, but Ellen noticed. She noticed when the operator beside her received a new set of ink ribbons, after using frayed ones for months. She noticed when a worn-out heating stove was replaced without request. She noticed when telegram fees were waived for those sending news to families in the hospital. And then came the letters, not the usual ones, but folded slips of paper, left tucked beneath her doorstep at twilight. No handwriting she recognized, no initials, only single lines. Some fires destroy, others reveal what remains standing. Another night, you once asked if kindness remained in a world of iron. You are the proof that it does. And finally, if a man's name has brought pain, may his silence now offer peace. Each note left her breathless, trembling, clutching the message to her chest as if it might disappear. She did not tell Mary Lou, did not show the others, but with each passing day, something inside her shifted. The anger she had carried, so heavy and sharp, began to soften, like coal cooling beneath snow. The betrayal that had wounded her no longer bled. It merely ached, quietly, when she remembered how his eyes had met hers the day he stood beside her desk, before she ever knew his name. One evening, as she crossed the street near the station, she passed a lamplighter at work. The man hummed softly as he raised the flame into its glass cage. Ellen paused, watching the light flicker into existence, chasing away the shadows. She clutched the final note in her hand, the one that had said nothing of titles nor apologies, only a single sentence. Forgiveness is not owed, but I will wait for it, even in silence. That night, for the first time in weeks, she opened the drawer of her desk and removed his letter, the one signed Henry Caldwell. She read it in full, then again and again. And when she folded it carefully and placed it beside the others, she lit a single candle by the window, not for light, but so that perhaps from wherever he sat in that cold city, he might see that the flame still burned. March arrived without ceremony. The snow receded into the gutters, leaving behind puddles the color of coal dust and cobblestones stained with the residue of too many heavy weeks. The city breathed again, but it was a breath held tight, as if fearing the next blow. Ellen Prescott walked to the rebuilt telegraph station with her collar drawn high, not for the wind, but for the way eyes followed her now. Whispers rose in her wake, not hostile but charged. People glanced down alleys before speaking, lingered at newsstands longer than usual, murmured around newspapers folded in half but gripped too tightly. She didn't understand why. Not yet. It wasn't until she stepped inside the station, set down her gloves, and noticed the silence that clung to the walls like smoke that she knew something had changed again. Mary Lou approached, her mouth a tight line, her cheeks blotched with color. "Have you seen it?" she asked without greeting. Ellen shook her head. Mary Lou handed her a folded copy of the Evening Tribune, the ink still fresh, the corners softened from being passed through too many hands. Ellen's eyes dropped to the headline, "The Iron Tycoon with a Poet's Heart." Her breath hitched. Below the headline, a sketch of Henry Caldwell, recognizable even in black strokes, stood above 2 columns of prose. The piece began like any other society piece, detached, factual, polished. But the further it unfolded, the more the words trembled with something else, emotion perhaps, or scandal disguised as admiration. It detailed how Henry Caldwell had anonymously funded the restoration of the Clark Street station, how he had quietly lobbied for better working conditions without seeking credit, how he had been seen entering a modest boarding house once, twice after the strike, and how, according to unnamed sources, the tycoon had fallen for a woman not of his class, but of great moral conviction. One sentence brought heat to Ellen's skin and made her ears ring. Sources claim the woman is a telegraph operator, anonymous until now, who captured the heart of one of Chicago's most powerful men, not with beauty or status, but with letters. She stepped outside before the nausea could rise. The streets now felt closer, as if every passerby knew the weight of her secrets. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded with betrayal, with panic, with something she couldn't yet name. And above all, she needed to see him, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. By the time Ellen reached the steps of Henry Caldwell's mansion, her gloves were soaked, her hem streaked with filth from the street, and her throat raw from the cold air. She climbed the marble steps as if they were made of thorns. The butler hesitated only a second before admitting her, startled not by her presence, but by the storm in her eyes. Henry was alone in the study, seated beneath tall windows streaked with rain. He looked older than she remembered, or perhaps just more human. He rose the moment he saw her. "Ellen, you told no one," she said. Her voice was low, sharp with wounded pride. "But someone knew. Someone always knows." He remained silent. "You should have destroyed the letters," she said, stepping closer. "You should have never written them in the first place if you intended to lie." His face tightened. "I never lied in the letters." "You signed them with a stranger's name," she cried. "I signed them with my initials. I never claimed to be anyone else." "You never claimed to be the man who decides who eats in this city and who starves. You never claimed to be the name that causes doors to close the moment it's spoken." "I never wanted to be that man to you," he said quietly. Ellen turned away, eyes burning. "And now the entire city thinks I sold my dignity for your attention, that I'm your pet charity project, a good deed you tucked into your coat pocket and showed off when the timing was convenient." "No," Henry said, stepping forward, his voice trembling. "You are the one thing I have done that had nothing to do with convenience. I wrote to you because I was drowning in a life that looked perfect on paper. I came to you because your words reminded me I was still capable of feeling something. You came to me," she said, her voice breaking, "because I was safe behind anonymity, because you knew the moment I saw your name, everything would change." He didn't argue. He couldn't. She turned to face him, hands trembling. "Did you plan it this way, to gain my affection, hide your name, and then let the world paint us into some sordid story when you finally grew bored of pretending?" "No," he whispered. "I never planned any of it. I only meant to answer a message that moved me. Then I couldn't stop. And the longer it went on, the more afraid I became. Afraid that if I told you too soon, you'd stop writing. Afraid that if I waited too long, I'd lose your trust forever." "You have," she said, though the words came softer than she intended. Henry looked at her then, Not with pride, not with entitlement, but with a sorrow that reached all the way to the roots of his being. "I don't ask for forgiveness," he said. "Not anymore. I only ask that you believe me when I say that your letters didn't just change my days. They changed me." Ellen's breath caught. Her hands gripped the back of a velvet chair. Her heart wanted to believe him. Her soul wanted to close the distance between them and fall into the safety of the only person who had seen her through more than her silhouette. But her pride stood tall, and her disappointment stood taller. She stepped away. "I believed you once, when you were just ink and silence, when you were someone I trusted without ever seeing your face." He took a single step forward, then stopped himself. "Do you believe that I loved you, even in that silence?" he asked. Ellen did not answer. Not with words. She turned toward the door, paused, and then, without looking back, she walked away. Henry stood in the study for a long time after the door closed. Rain streaked down the windows, blurring the view of the city that once answered to his name. He remained there until the last fire went out, alone with only the letters that had once lit the path between them. And now, all that remained was the echo of a name that no longer mattered, his own. The final snows of March melted in narrow ribbons along the gutters of South Clark Street, leaving behind puddles laced with soot and reflections too fragmented to recognize. Chicago moved on as cities always do, one telegram, one train, one silence at a time. The Western Union office, once blackened and bruised, had been repaired. Its tall windows gleamed now, newly fitted, and the brass keys on the telegraph machines had been polished to a quiet shine. But even with the repairs, something within the station felt softer, as if the walls themselves remembered the voices that had once echoed there in smoke and anger. Ellen Prescott resumed her work in silence. She arrived each morning before the light fully rose and left only after the last message had been filed. Her eyes, once bright with inner monologue, were now distant, as if she lived half in the present and half in the memory of someone who no longer wrote. The box arrived on a Thursday. It was left with the morning deliveries, small, square, and crafted from smooth walnut wood, with a carved edge that bore no monogram, no crest, nothing but the grain of time etched in silence. The young delivery boy had no explanation. She brought it into the back room, placed it on the desk beside the window, and stared at it for several minutes before lifting the lid. Inside, carefully bundled in silk ribbon, were her letters. Every one she had sent. Each one flattened, preserved, their ink still strong, their creases lovingly smoothed. Beneath them lay a folded note. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, the handwriting unmistakable even before she saw the signature. "I kept them because they saved me. If they no longer mean anything to you, return them. I will understand. H." Ellen pressed the letter to her chest. A storm gathered within her, not of anger, but of ache. The kind that settled in the lungs and made it difficult to speak, even when no one asked her to. The letters were not a gesture. They were not an apology. They were a relic of something unspoken, something real. He had not sent them to ask for her heart again. He had sent them because he had nowhere else to keep the parts of himself that had once belonged to her. She sat still for a long time before rising, leaving the box untouched. She did not tell Mary Lou. She did not ask permission. That afternoon, when the sun dipped low and the streets began to empty, Ellen walked the 7 blocks to the train station. Gloveless, bareheaded, her coat still fastened with the mismatched button from winter. Union Station was quieter than usual. The strikes had shifted timetables, and though trains still arrived and departed, they did so with less ceremony, less bustle. The tiled floor glistened with melted snow, and the scent of coal and iron filled the air. She moved past the ticket counters, past the great arches, until she reached the far end of the platform, track 5. She remembered this place. It was here, weeks ago, that she had paused one morning to observe the carriages pulling away. She had stood beside the waiting rail, unaware that across the platform someone else had stood in the shadow of a pillar, watching her in silence. Now, beneath the same roof of iron and glass, he was there again. Henry Caldwell stood alone. No guards, no assistants, no hat, only a charcoal overcoat buttoned to the throat, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture neither proud nor expectant. He saw her as she approached, but he did not move forward. Ellen stopped 3 paces away. For a moment, the world dissolved. No trains, no announcements, no wind. Only 2 people and the ache of everything they had not said. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, voice low, touched by something fragile. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. He nodded once. "I'm leaving the city." Her heart clenched, though her face remained still. "I'm not running," he added. "Not from scandal, nor from shame. Only from the man I used to be, and towards something quieter. Something I haven't known in a very long time." Ellen looked at him. Not as a tycoon, not as the name printed on society columns, but as the man who had once signed a letter with only 2 initials and written truths, too tender for any room but her heart. "And what is it you hope to find out there?" she asked softly. He inhaled slowly. "Nothing," he said. "Only peace, and the hope that silence this time won't be a burden, but a choice." She studied him, the lines near his eyes, the weariness that no wealth could erase, and beneath it, something else. Humility, perhaps, or simply fatigue from having fought too long to be someone the world applauded, while losing the only thing that had made him feel human. She took a single step forward. "You asked if the letters still meant something," she said. "They do, they always will." Henry swallowed, the tension in his jaw faltering. "But I can't give you back what we had," she added. "Because what we had was protected by illusion. It was written in a world where names didn't matter." "I know," he said, almost a whisper. She reached into her coat and withdrew 1 single letter, the first he had sent her, still folded at the edges, still faintly scented with the ink he used. "I'm not returning all of them," she said, her voice trembling. "Only this one, so you remember who you were, before you told me your name." He accepted the letter with both hands. No words followed. Ellen looked past him at the train waiting at the platform, steam curling into the evening like a curtain about to fall. "I hope," she said, her eyes meeting his for one last moment, "that wherever you go, you continue writing, even if it's only to yourself." He nodded, his throat too tight for speech. She turned to go, but before she could take the second step, he spoke again, softly, almost brokenly. "I'll wait," he said, "not for an answer, just for the memory to remain." Ellen did not look back. She walked through the station, her chest rising with a breath that hurt and healed all at once. And when she stepped into the cold night air, she closed her eyes, letting the wind wash over her like a benediction. Behind her a train whistled once, sharp, clear, and full of farewell. The train waited like a breath held in winter. Its black body glistened beneath the early morning mist that rose from the tracks like a veil. Steam hissed from beneath the wheels, white and restless, curling around the boots of passengers moving with purpose. Porters lifted trunks onto carriages. Children clutched the hands of mothers in quiet awe. The station, usually heavy with voices and movement, seemed to slow for her, just for her. As Ellen Prescott stepped onto the platform, she wore her simplest traveling coat, the one without satin trim or brass buttons. It was not the garment of a woman running toward a future. It was the coat of someone leaving something behind, with reverence, not regret. Her hands held no luggage, only choice. He sat near the window, just as he had the day before, though neither had spoken since. Henry Caldwell, once shadowed by rooms filled with chandeliers and whispered titles, now sat like any other man. Shoulders slightly hunched, hat resting on his knee, eyes not searching, but waiting. His overcoat, worn at the cuffs, bore no crest or silver chain. The man who had once ruled over rail lines and towers of smoke was now simply a passenger. Ellen approached without a word. She stepped into the car, and down the narrow aisle with quiet steps. When she reached him, she did not speak. She simply sat beside him. Her gloved hand, slow and deliberate, reached across the space between them and found his. He did not turn to look at her, but the way he exhaled, slow, measured, reverent, said everything. His fingers closed around hers, as if he had been holding his breath for 1,000 days, and only now remembered how to breathe. The train pulled forward, its wheels creaking in protest before settling into rhythm. They did not speak for miles. Outside the windows, the city fell behind them, bricks and soot and long chimneys reduced to silhouettes beneath a rising sun. The farther they traveled, the cleaner the air became, the softer the landscape turned. Fields gave way to frozen streams, and the sky opened wide above them like a letter unfolded. Henry stared out the window for a long time, the shadow of Chicago clinging to his thoughts. But when he finally turned to her, what he found was not doubt or confrontation. It was peace. They reached their destination by nightfall, a small town along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. No carriages waited for them. No one called their names. They walked from the station in silence, the sound of their footsteps muffled by a dusting of snow. A modest home sat on the edge of a wooded lane. Its shutters were plain, its roof sloped with quiet dignity, and its porch faced the water as if it had always been waiting to witness something worth remembering. Inside, the rooms were still. A fire crackled in the hearth, a kettle waited on the stove. Everything was simple, clean, chosen. No servants moved through the hall, no polished silver reflected flickering candlelight. There were no portraits on the walls, no evidence of the past they had left behind. Only books on the shelf, a table for two, and silence, the kind that doesn't suffocate, but settles gently around the heart. Henry placed his coat on the rack and looked at her, not with the gaze of a man who had won something, but with the eyes of someone who had learned how to lose with grace, and in that loss found something truer. "You don't owe me this," he said softly. Ellen stepped out of her shoes, unpinned her hair, and met his gaze. "I didn't come to settle a debt," she replied. "I came because there was no place else I wanted to go." In the months that followed, they lived not as society had once defined them, but as they had chosen for themselves. He became a man who rose early to fetch firewood, who wrote in the margins of old books, who grew quiet when the wind stirred the lake too fiercely. She became a woman who walked barefoot in spring, who returned to writing not for publication, but for herself. A woman who no longer feared being invisible, for she had been seen, completely, irrevocably. They kept the box of letters in a drawer near the hearth. They never reread them aloud. But once in a while she would place her hand over the lid, as if reminding herself that even paper could survive the fire if held with care. Their days unfolded not in grandeur, but in gestures, a steaming cup of tea left on the window ledge, a glove mended by the fire, a glance held a second longer than necessary. And their nights, their nights were wrapped not in silk, but in breath and warmth. The kind of closeness that asks for nothing but presence. No vows, no claims, just the sound of two souls exhaling the weight of everything they once carried. He was no longer Caldwell the Tycoon. She was no longer Prescott the operator. They were Henry and Ellen, two people who had built a home not out of bricks or fortune, but out of letters, faith, and the impossible courage it takes to love without guarantees. Their story was no longer written in telegrams or newsprint. It was written in days, in the way she lit the lamp before he entered a room, in the way he kissed her temple each night without needing a reason, in the silence they shared, one that spoke more than all the words they had ever exchanged, a silence no longer made of smoke, but of peace. Lake Michigan, spring of 1899. The wind had softened with the season. Where once the cold had sliced through wool and pride alike, now the breeze carried the scent of lilacs and wet earth. The lake, ever faithful, glimmered beneath the morning sun like a polished coin tossed by time itself. The world had changed, And yet, some things remained untouched. The modest house on the hill stood just as it had those 12 years before. Its white shutters faded now, its wooden porch creaking with memory. Ivy curled along the stone foundation, and inside, laughter echoed faintly from the kitchen, where a girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stillness stirred dough with more enthusiasm than technique. Henry Caldwell, his hair now touched with silver, sat beneath the old elm tree by the water's edge, a leather-bound journal resting on his knee. His hands, once accustomed to signing contracts worth fortunes, now moved with quiet purpose, sketching not words, but moments. He drew the girl in the window, the curve of her cheek, the way her hair never stayed pinned. Ellen watched from the porch, her arms folded loosely, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. Time had not erased the weight of what they had once endured, but it had mercifully softened the sharpest edges. Her eyes, still a warm hazel, held stories she no longer needed to tell. They had married quietly 2 springs after the day she stepped onto the train. Not out of duty or convention, but because they both knew that a love built from silence and survival deserved a name, even if the world no longer cared to hear it. Their daughter, Clara, was born in the first summer of their new life. She carried Henry's contemplative nature and Ellen's defiance, wrapped in a small frame and an unshakable curiosity about the world. She asked questions that made poets pause and merchants sigh. And when she wrote, because she had learned to write before she learned to read, her words came like rivers after thaw, honest, relentless, full of life. The world outside their home shifted with the turn of the century. The railroads expanded westward. Telegraph lines, once the heartbeat of progress, began to give way to the telephone. Machines that once seemed threatening now became familiar. Factories rose taller. Newspapers screamed louder. Wealth grew faster and vanished just as easily. The name Caldwell had all but vanished from the boardrooms of Chicago. After Henry refused to return to his position, others took control. Some succeeded, others fell. One man, embittered by Henry's quiet retreat and moral rebellion, had leveraged his ambition too far and lost everything in a market crash in '94. His name, once feared, had become a cautionary tale. Samuel Worthington, loyal to the end, visited once each autumn. He never married, though he carried the gentlest fondness for Clara and always brought her marzipan wrapped in wax paper. He lived in a modest apartment above a bookshop now, and when he spoke of the past, it was with the tone of a man who had stood close to history, but chosen the quiet corner instead of the stage. As for Ellen, she wrote, she no longer published under her name, but her essays appeared in journals and small local papers under the pseudonym E.P. Women read her words by firelight and recognized themselves in her quiet battles, in the dignity of her defiance. She taught Clara that words were not only for telling the truth, but for protecting it. She and Henry did not speak often of how they had come to be. The story was stitched into the walls, in the grooves of the floorboards, in the creak of the porch swing where they sat each evening when the wind turned warm. Their love had changed, not in strength, but in rhythm. It no longer flared like fire in a hearth. It glowed like embers in a lantern, steady and constant. They had known bitterness. They had walked away from each other and chosen to return. That was the difference between romance and devotion, and theirs had become the latter. One evening, as the lake mirrored the soft lavender of the twilight sky, Clara curled beside her father with a book in her lap. "Did Mama really write all those letters before she even knew your name?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Henry looked up from his sketch and nodded slowly. "She knew my heart before she ever saw my face," he said, "and that made all the difference." Inside, Ellen smiled without turning. She had heard him. She always did. The world would go on. Progress would march forward in steel and smoke. But in one quiet house beside the lake, love had outlived the iron. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered. And so this story comes to a close, but not without leaving us with something precious. Ellen and Henry taught us that love isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's born in silence, in ink on a page, in a single glance across a crowded room. And sometimes the strongest loves are the ones that survive the fire, not because they never broke, but because they chose to heal. 12 years later, their hearts still beat, not for what they once were, but for what they built, together, against all odds. This story reminds us that second chances don't come wrapped in certainty. They come with risk, with humility, and with hope. But if we dare to reach across the distance, between class, between wounds, between names, we may just find something timeless waiting on the other side. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in love that grows quietly but lasts forever. And if you made it all the way here, write the word lantern in the comments. That way, I'll know you were one of the souls who stayed until the final ember. There are more heartfelt stories like this waiting for you. I've left a few up here in the cards, just for you. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most powerful stories are the ones we carry with us long after the last word is spoken.